Hello, everyone. We're going to start our webinar here in just shortly, but welcome. Glad you could join us and hang on just for a few. We will give everybody a little time to get here. Hey, well, it is 1 o'clock, and again, we are excited to have you here. We'll go ahead and get started. The Start Here webinar on employee ownership. That's a Start Here webinar. I am with the organization New Growth, which is hosting this with the Start Here Business Acceleration Network. I work with New Growth, a community development corporation based in West Central Missouri, and we are working to build communities and businesses in the region. And our Start Here network is been together for several years now. And what it is people and organizations in this region that are connecting our resources, business development resources, trying to make sure that we leave no rural entrepreneur behind. And so in doing that, we have done a lot of work building up how we work together. We refer businesses to each other, and we work with communities to make sure and try to build entrepreneurship as a strategy that we use in rural communities to build what we have going on here. And that's why we're really excited to have Keith Davenport with us today, because we're working again with Start Here, technical assistance for small businesses, working to build credit scores so people can get finances they need, and also small loans up to $50,000 are things that New Growth offers through the Start Here Business Acceleration Network. And I have that contact information we'll show again. But the Missouri Center for Employee Ownership is an organization that has been formed and funded also by the Kaufman Foundation to really look at how we build up this opportunity for businesses to stay in business and go to the next generation through employee ownership. And Keith Davenport will be with us giving a presentation. We're going to be also inviting your questions. In the lower bar, you'll see a Q&A place where you can enter your questions at any time. I'll be looking for that. And also you can chat with each other through the chat function. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to turn you all into participants as in a meeting, so you can actually interact with Keith and ask him, and we can have a discussion then. So we look forward to hearing from you on that. Enter your questions. Keith Davenport, he has been working in for governments and consulting with corporations for many years after receiving his Master of Public Affairs at the University of Missouri's Truman School of Government and Public Affairs, Johnson County, Kansas, and Kansas government, Johnson Community College. A lot of work in that space of looking at businesses and how we build our communities. And that's why we wanted to really look at this, because rural communities really need those businesses that we have to continue. So we don't want to lose them if they don't have a next generation. So that's why Keith is on the call today, and we're looking forward to hearing from him about how we can do this in our rural communities. Keith, take it away. I have relinquished my screen to you.
Great. Thank you so much, and for the chance to be here and connect with all of you. I am definitely excited to connect today. And Patty gave you a little bit about my background. We're based in the Kansas City area. I've been in Kansas City since 2008, but I'm actually from a very small town. Grew up in rural Illinois. My hometown didn't have a stoplight. We were a population about 2,500 people, and you can still remember we had one grocery store and 2 banks, I think 2 gas stations in town. And so talking about rural businesses and rural economies and what it means to be in that community is part of my roots. And so it's something that I know I know what it's like to live there and think about when one business closes or an owner goes to retire and can't find someone to buy the business, what that can actually mean for a main street or for a local community. So just a little bit about what I want to do today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what our organization is and does, and then address a little bit more broadly what it is when we talk about a silver tsunami and what we're seeing in Missouri in particular. We're going to take a look at some maps and some data from Southwest Missouri in particular. And then we're going to dig into these employee ownership models, give some examples of some businesses that have used the different models. I'll share a little bit of technical information for you, and then we'll save a good amount of time at the end for questions and answers. Feel free to drop those questions that you have as you have them throughout the presentation in the Q&A. And Patty can jump in and ask those out loud if it's something that we need to address before we move on. And then if not, we can come back to them at the end of the time. So with all that being said, let's get started. So the Missouri Center for Employee Ownership, we're part of the Employee Ownership Expansion Network. It's a group of nonprofit organizations. There's about 20 of us all together, 20 state centers for employee ownership, where we do education outreach on these models as a way to help local economies stay strong and resilient, and continuing on past the exit of baby boomers from the ownership workplace. In 2021, we received funding from the Kauffman Foundation from their entrepreneurship work group to do 3 years of programming across the state of Missouri and Eastern Kansas. That was a match grant, and one of our leading founding matchers was the Great Game of Business, based there in Springfield. And they do consulting on open book management and business growth, and the value of teaching your employees financial literacy as a way to help them have the ownership mindset to help move that business move forward. So we were created, and the funding that we received is really to address a particular issue in Missouri. And that's the silver tsunami. So in Missouri, about 52% of all privately owned businesses are owned by somebody 55 or older. And we know when we look at national data around small businesses that about 85% of business owners don't have a succession plan at all. And so what we often see is a business owner decides they want to retire, and maybe that's, I think I'm going to retire this year or next year, but they haven't actually thought of a plan at all, or it's the first time they're thinking about it. And this often happens because this small business in particular that they've been investing years or decades into, and maybe even it's a family-owned business, and so maybe they're second or third generation. This has been their baby, and closely even tied sometimes to their identity. And so it's likely been difficult for them to envision a life apart from that business. And so they just haven't thought about it. It's something that they're like, hey, I'll think about that when it's time to go, or I'm not going to think about that now. It can be kind of a sad process for them. But then what we do find is when they do finally start thinking about what does it mean to exit, it can be difficult to find someone to buy their business. And that's can be particularly true in rural areas that you maybe don't have, there's maybe not the infrastructure or the transportation, an interstate might not go by, so you can't really transport out. And so there might not be the local economy just to support a new business or somebody who wants to buy something in that area. But even in the cases when they don't have maybe a child who can take it over, I'm hearing this a lot from business owners in Missouri, that they've got to the third or fourth generation, and this next generation in the family, it just has no interest in the business, or they aren't ready to actually run the business. And so when you look at more traditional selling options where maybe a private equity were to come in or a competitor, that can create some challenges too. For the business owner, it might feel like it could ruin the legacy, kind of what they built there, or change the culture. But what can be more challenging for a local community is that those jobs in an acquisition, some people might lose their jobs, or some of those jobs might get moved to another community or even another state. And so we really look at this as a growing challenge for rural communities in particular, but it can be in urban and suburban areas as well, where there's this threat that these businesses and jobs can leave the communities as this growing number of baby boomer business owners look to exit the workforce. And I want to look at what this looks like in numbers wise. I mentioned 52%. That's about 56,000 businesses statewide that have owners age 55 or over. This is a map that's interactive. It's available. You can look at it at our website, moceo.org/map. Just scroll down a little bit and it'll be there. And you can click in on any of the areas in the map at the county level to get county level data. You can also click in on the different industries around that circle graph to get industry specific data. This map is a heat map. And so the darker the color of the county, the higher percentage of the businesses in that county that are owned by somebody 55 or older. And so when we look overall at what's really at stake, so statewide, it's $119 billion of revenue annually. But at the county level, of course, that can be very much more specific. And you all know your communities well. I want to take just a little bit of a snapshot in Southwest Missouri to cover some of the area that overlaps with what New Growth service area. So thinking about Greene County, so it's 49% in Greene County, and you can see that graph in the top right has changed to adjust for that local area. So 2,800 businesses and 35,000 employees. You can see that the industries that are most significant there in terms of make up the highest percentage are those professional services, retail trade, and healthcare and social assistance. Looking at Polk County, it's 48%. Smaller community, we're only talking about 265 businesses there, but that's still 3,000 individuals who are employed by these businesses and makes up a significant amount of the overall economy there. In Dallas County, this is one of the top 10 counties as far as highest percentage of baby boomer owned businesses. It's at 87% of all the privately owned businesses there are owned by baby boomer. So this is one of those counties where for even just one or two businesses, if they aren't able to find someone local to take it over, that could mean a significant shift in the local economy. And I know that I'm not telling you something that you don't already know in this regard. You know what businesses have been around for forever. You know where people work. You know that if a company closes, there's not just a competitor down the street that can take and absorb all those employees of that workforce. And so we're really trying to think about employee ownership as an opportunity to keep those businesses and jobs in those communities. In Webster County, that's 40%. In Lawrence County, 52%. In Jasper County, 56%. And then looking again back at the statewide map, if you were to sort of go north, so New Growth area, that 15 county area between Springfield and Kansas City, we're looking at 35, 40, 45% in most of that area, spanning between the ones we looked at in Kansas City and Jackson County. Just a quick note, the few counties that are completely white, the population is small enough. We don't have good data there. So it's not that they're 0% baby boomer business owners. It's just that we don't have data for those few counties. But all that to say, we can see the ways in which this is something that we need to be talking about. And when you think about for those of you on the call who come from that business development or economic development side of things, typically when we're talking about economic development, people are talking about how do we try to recruit or entice new businesses to build here. And while we like to talk about business retention, it's typically doesn't get the priority in terms of money or time when we're talking with elected officials or local leaders about where to invest our time. But we can see that if we don't start thinking about business retention a little bit more intentionally, that we could have some real local economic challenges in the near future. For those of you who are business owners, what this might mean for you, you're here, so you're at least open to be talking about retirement or moving on to your next business venture. we talk a lot about this as an option for people who are retiring, but it also works for entrepreneurs who like to start a business, grow it to scale, and then sell it and move on to their next one. And so this is very much relevant to you as an option to help maintain your legacy and take care of your employees at the point in which you're ready to leave the business. So overall, employee ownership, no matter really how you want to evaluate a business success, employee-owned businesses outperform their peers, other companies that are not employee-owned. It tends to be better for the employees. We're talking about lower turnover rates, higher median wage, higher household net income. But we're also talking about it being beneficial for the business. Businesses tend to grow at a higher rate, the ones that are employee owned over those that are not. They also tend to have higher revenue in sales year over year. So again, about any way that you would measure a business's success, employee-owned businesses tend to outperform their peers that are not employee-owned. There was a research study that was published in the Harvard Business Review just last year that also specifically points out the ways in which employee ownership can help close wealth gaps along racial and other demographic lines, and can help raise the overall net worth for those also who would more typically be in the lower socioeconomic status. So for example, when we talk about what are the biggest drivers for personal wealth, well, we know that the two biggest drivers are home ownership and business ownership. And what employee ownership does is it gives individuals the opportunity to have the benefit of business ownership who likely wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity. So you can see just naturally, if you all of a sudden give an individual who would not otherwise have the capital or the resources to own their own business, the benefits of business ownership, you've changed not just their lives, but generationally at the way that wealth can impact them. So it has, in addition to some of these local economic benefits, some significant social benefits as well. Okay, so that's the problem we're trying to address, some of the benefits of employee ownership. So now let's actually talk about what is employee ownership. There are several different business models that might fit into this category, but there are three primary ones that get talked about the most. And then we at the Missouri Center for Employee Ownership, we specifically work in these first two. So I want to give just a really brief overview of these three different models. And then I'm going to dig into 6 different businesses and their kind of interaction with employee ownership. Then I'll come back to flesh out some of the technical side of things. So the one model that you are likely most familiar with or may have heard of before are ESOPs, or employee stock ownership plans. There are about 180 ESOPs in the state of Missouri, and there are about 6,800 to 7,000 of them nationally. So ESOPs are a company-funded retirement plan that allow the company to distribute the values of shares of the business to their employees at no cost to the employees. And it functions much like a 401k does, except for the employees don't have to pay any money into it. And the longer the employee works there, the more shares they receive, and hopefully with the growth of the business, the higher the values of those shares. And so then when the employee leaves the business, the business buys out their shares, and so that becomes an additional retirement benefit or exit benefit for those employees. We'll dig a little bit more into some of the technical pieces of that later, but broadly speaking, there's public policy in place that allows the business owner to sell to the company in this way. They develop this ESOP, and then it's usually a leveraged transaction where there's a bank involved. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of those details in just a little bit. But this is your more typical way where, from the business's standpoint, they've created a trust that then holds the shares of the business, and then it distributes those shares to the employees. From the employee's perspective, they don't actually get a certificate of stock ownership, but they get the benefits of the ownership by being able to get the values of those shares from working there. Worker cooperatives, these are it's not a retirement benefit, but instead this is going to be much like you're familiar with agricultural cooperatives or rural electric cooperatives, except for the members of the cooperative are individual farms or different businesses. The members of the cooperative are the workers themselves. And so those members then get to vote on a board of directors who then runs the business. And then instead of getting shares of the business, what they get instead is a share of the profits annually. And then when they leave the business, the cooperative gives them the amount that's in their account that's in the share of their share of the profits. Employee ownership trusts, EOTs, those are very popular in the United Kingdom, but it's pretty new to the United States. I think there's only about 2 or 3 dozen in the US. I forgot worker cooperatives. There's about 600 of them in the US. I know of about 3 or 4 in Missouri currently. EOTs are kind of a simple way to think about it as ESOPs light. And what I mean by that is they're more flexible than ESOPs. They're less regulated than ESOPs, but they have a little bit fewer benefits than ESOPs. So you can still lean into that idea of employee ownership broadly and some of the internal benefits of those, but you don't quite get all the tax benefits and you don't have all the regulations. So it's sort of an ESOP light. I'm going to spend most of my time today on the ESOPs and worker cooperatives. I have been talking with, actually, I just got another email today from another business owner wanting to talk about employee-owned trusts in Missouri. So it's definitely starting to gain steam, and there are service providers that work on those. They're just much less common. So for those of you in Southwest Missouri, probably an ESOP that you're most familiar with is SRC Holdings. SRC is typically listed, they have on their website as one of the best small businesses in America, but they also tend to be at a list of one of the top 10 or top 20 best ESOPs in America. They have this great story. Jack Stack was their owner. Essentially, that company was going to get shut down by their holding company. The employees came together and got financing to buy them out, and eventually in 1983, they became an ESOP. And what's really neat about this particular story is that Jack Stack, who was the owner who sold to the ESOP, he's actually stayed on. He still serves as their CEO and is very much engaged. And they've, of course, grown and diversified. They now are a family of companies. A Great Game of Business is one of them. But they have this, they have so many great stories, but I heard one in particular where when they, one of my, a business owner that I work with, sorry about that, a business owner that I work with went and toured their facilities to try and get a sense of what this employee ownership looked like and things. And they were on just their manufacturing floor of their sort of entry level and mid-level blue collar workers. And the person giving them the tour said, there are at least 2 millionaires on the floor right now. And it was just speaking to the fact that these longtime employees had been with the company for long enough that the value of their shares had grown to the level where when they retire, they would retire as millionaires. And of course, that's best case scenario of working at a growing company over a long term, but it's the power of employee ownership. They also tell a story about this ownership mindset. And so they had an employee who was responsible for purchasing and then doing the sort of the plastic wrapping around the parts that they were shipping out. And this employee realized the ways in which her own job impacted the bottom line for the company. And then in turn, what her valuation would be when she got that statement each year about the value of her shares. And so she took it upon herself to go back out and look for some competition on where they were sourcing their plastic wrap, and they ended up saving the business tens of thousands of dollars annually by just sourcing from a more affordable place. And that came from that frontline employee who had that ownership mindset and was able to apply that to the daily ways she did her job. And so it's a great story of how an ESOP that has really impacted and come to national notoriety for their effective implications here. Second business I want to share with you is the Stone Soup Farm. So this is out of Massachusetts. They're actually take this idea of worker cooperatives and they apply it 2 ways. So they are a worker cooperative. They only have 3 to 5 employees. They farm just a few acres in Western Massachusetts, and those farmers are the members of the cooperative. They elect a board and they govern it in a shared governance democratic workplace. But in addition to a worker cooperative, they're also a consumer cooperative. And so they invite the public, their customers, their consumers, to become members by subscribing each year. So there's a winter subscription and a summer subscription where you pay a flat rate and then you get a share of the harvest from that based on what comes out of that. And so this allows them to essentially grow to scale. So instead of these farmers, which might each only have an acre or half an acre by themselves, or the capital to buy that land, by those members pooling together to be employee owners, they're able to have more land. And then because they have members from the consumers as well, they have that cash flow to pay their employees to do the work and to sustain year over year. So this is a small worker cooperative that works very well. And in the farming community as a whole, we're seeing a lot more leaning into this cooperative model. I know we're familiar with agricultural cooperatives, but even on a smaller level, there is this growing interest in talking about sort of developing this cooperative landscape. So you have sort of these different cooperatives that all work together. So you might have this worker cooperative where the members they run and own the business. Then you might have some type of agricultural or farmer cooperative where 3 or 4 or 5 different farms come together under some shared branding and marketing. So they get to leverage that to save costs and go to scale there. And then you have the consumer marketing piece where you have the public that's buying the goods also paying into that and being members and getting some of the benefits of the company. So this is definitely a conversation worth having in the rural area. A third example is CK Supply. This is out of St. Louis, and they're actually an ESOP. And they are about 3 years old. And what I mean by that is they're 3 years into being an ESOP. They're actually on, I believe, their 3rd generation. And so what had happened is, the first generation started the business, 2nd generation took it over. But when it got to the 3rd generation, there was more kids. They were scattered a little bit more nationally. There wasn't quite the interest among all of them to be engaged at the same level as generation 1 and generation 2. And so they decided to become a partial ESOP. So I believe they're a 30% ESOP, if I'm remembering that correctly. So one of those kids has stayed on as an executive vice president, but others in that generation are detached from it now. So they are now an ESOP. And what's really neat about them, just this recently, they tell a story. They actually acquired a new business. And so they themselves bought a smaller business in the Kansas City market that was doing some similar work. And at the same time that they were buying this business, there was another small business that also sold from Kansas City. So you have 2 Kansas City-based businesses doing similar work. So one of them sold to private equity. And when that happened, the owner of that business, of course, got a payout from private equity and got to walk away with the money they had put into the business, maybe a little bit more. But those employees are kind of at the mercy of that private equity firm about what was going to happen in the future of their jobs and salaries and so on. On the flip side, the second small business in Kansas City, they sold to CK Supply, and that owner negotiated that all of his employees would be a part of their ESOP as soon as the transaction went through. And that was a real attractive selling point for that seller. And so CK Supply worked with them and made that happen so that those employees, unlike private equity, as soon as this transaction went through, they automatically got this new company paid retirement benefit that was going to start paying into of this ESOP. And so they got an additional benefit there. And that actually reminds me of another way in which employee ownership can be beneficial to the employees. You might be familiar with Cliff Bar, the like breakfast granola protein bars. Last year, they did a multi-billion-dollar deal and sold to one of their competitors. And at that time, they were 30% employee owned. He took the sale price of their business and he took 30% of that and divided by all the number of employees they had. On average, every employee walked away from that transaction with a $500,000 check. Where if that company had not been employee owned at all, the employees would have seen no benefit from that transaction at all. So kind of on the flip side, while we are really in the business of creating new employee owned businesses, the flip side is when an employee owned business sells, the employees get a benefit of that as well. Here's another example. Those next three examples are of actual businesses in Missouri where I've been talking to the owners at some point, and I'm just changing some of the details and I'm using some stock photos to talk about it just because it's confidential. They haven't made a transaction yet, but it's based on conversations actually happening in Missouri right now. So I was talking with the textile company owner. It was similarly a third generation family business. And the kids were getting to retirement age of this third generation. Fourth generation wasn't really interested. In fact, third generation, the business was kind of secondary. They all had different jobs. And so they had a pretty significant business that they were working on. And the way that I found out about them is actually the economic developer in the town reached out to me because he heard that they were looking to sell, and he was worried that this business, which was literally on Main Street in the central place of this rural community, was going to close and what that would mean for the community. So we started talking about this and working through worker cooperatives as a potential for them. And one of the things that was a challenge on the front end, and they're still in the discovery piece, is that they had because they didn't have owners that were really engaged in the day-to-day, they had kind of gone into maintenance mode a little bit. And so they maybe hadn't leveraged the growth and profits that were potentially there for them, which in any case, whether for employee ownership or not, that makes it harder to sell a business. So there were some things that they needed to work on internally before they'd be really ready to sell or do a transaction to employee ownership. A second example, there is a small community newspaper where in this case, the owner was not looking to retire, but was an entrepreneur who was wanting to move on to the next venture. And initially they wanted to explore ESOPs because they were familiar with them, they heard about them. But in talking, we found they were likely too small for an ESOP. I'll talk a little bit in just a minute about what it means to be too small. But they were likely too small. And so we began talking about a worker cooperative. And so we're able to say, like, okay, let's look at your employees. Do you have employees that you think could actually run the business? And the owner was like, yes, a couple of my employees have been there for decades. They're actually doing most of the work now. They could very much do the business. We just kind of have to teach them how to do the books. But I think that they could really run this, and it would keep this newspaper going in the local community. And so started exploring that, and they're still on the journey there of trying to figure out sort of the details and logistics if it's going to be a good fit or not. Last example that I have is a coffee shop. So a coffee shop, it's a mid-sized town. They actually have 2 locations in this area. Overall, they have about 40 employees. Only 10 of those are full-time. They do about 1 million to $1.5 million in revenue annually. Their EBITDA, I'm not sure exactly what their EBITDA was, but probably somewhere in the 200,000 to 300,000 range. And so began talking about a worker cooperative for them. And they've decided to go a little bit of a different direction, but what that would have looked like for them when you have full-time and part-time employees is those full-time employees could become members of the worker cooperative and actually run the business in that regard. But you wouldn't add in your part-time employees. Thinking about a coffee shop or maybe some retail situations, some lawn care things. A lot of times those part-time employees, and particularly entry level, those staff members are a little bit more short-term most of the time. And so when you think about the broad benefits of employee ownership, you actually get the benefits of that by working there for a long period of time. And so having those more transient short-term employees, there wouldn't be a lot of benefit for them to become members and do that. But I like to use this just for some simple math. I'll make up some different numbers for you on how this could work out. So if you had a coffee shop or another small business with 10 employees, and let's say that the value of the business, just for simple purposes, let's say the value of the business is $1 million, just an even 1 million. And so in a traditional, so this owner, they don't have kids that are going to take over. Their business is valued at $1 million. They don't want to sell to private equity or a competitor because they want, they worked so long to invest in the people and the community, and they want that business to keep going. They're going to stay in the community, so they don't want to go to the grocery store and run into a former employee that they've screwed over in some way. And so they're really looking for some options. Kids aren't going to do it. And so one option would be an employee buyout. This is likely what your mind might first go to. For the employees to buy out this owner, you'd have to have these 10 employees all come up with an average of $100,000 to buy out this $1 million business. It is not likely that 10 individuals working full-time at a coffee shop would have $100,000 in capital that they have easy access to. So that would be a pretty steep ask and not likely to happen. A worker cooperative, on the other hand, would give them a different option. So instead of the 10 employees buying the business, it's really organizing the business as a worker cooperative. And so the cooperative is the entity that buys the business. And then those 10 employees, they would just have to pay a membership fee to be members of the worker cooperative. So the worker cooperative gets financing, a combination likely of seller financing, potentially from a traditional bank, and what's more likely is financing from a CDFI or community development organization. So they buy out the owner, and then those 10 employees, instead of having to come up with $100,000 each to buy out the owner, they only have to come up with whatever you set that membership fee to be. So maybe it's $500 or $1,000 or $7,000. But all of a sudden, that ownership opportunity becomes much more realistic for those 10 employees. So once they've become members of the cooperative, they would vote on a board of directors that would have the lead role of the organization. That board of directors would determine if they want to do a traditional business structure with a management team or something a little bit more flat. And then it would run like really a normal business. But those members of the cooperative, they all get on the books a capital account. So at the end of every year, a predetermined rate, each of those 10 members would get a share of the profits, called dividends, or patronage is the more typical term in the cooperative world. They might get a little bit of cash, a direct check to pay. That's taxable income, so enough to pay their taxes. The rest just goes in the books as what sits in their account, and it just keeps growing year over year until they either leave or retire, and then they get to take that with them. So all of a sudden, the benefits of business ownership becomes possible for these 10 full-time coffee shop owners who otherwise would not have been able to maybe even keep their jobs, depending on what that owner decided to do with the coffee shop otherwise. So that's really the power of employee ownership. Okay, now for these next 10 minutes or so, let's just look a little bit about some of the technical side of things, and then we'll leave about 10 minutes here at the end for questions. So some key takeaways for ESOPs. I'm not going to go into the weeds on all these pieces. If you wanted a little bit more information, feel free to put that in the Q&A box on the bottom, or wait till we come together at the end and you can ask that. And then some of these, we actually have a great network of service providers for ESOPs and worker cooperatives, of attorneys and accountants that if I'm not able to answer it, I can either get you some information or connect you with somebody who can. So some key takeaways for ESOPs. So because ESOPs are an actual qualified retirement plan, it means they're regulated by the Department of Labor and the IRS. And these regulations are really meant to help make sure to protect the employees from getting fair treatment in the midst of these transactions. So they aren't just one-sided, where an owner can just make an unfair transaction, selling it to the employees, leave the employees with a bunch of debt, and then run away with all the money. That's essentially what those regulations are trying to keep from happening, and they do. But the way it works for the employees is really a company-funded retirement plan. So a lot of ESOPs still keep a 401k for employees, but not all do. But then they have this ESOP on top of it. So what they might end up getting is, so maybe they get 4 or 5, 6% of their salary in their 401k, and they might have to match half of that. But then after a few years of being an ESOP, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, that value, the number of shares they get and the value of those shares are growing significantly. So they might get another 5 or 10% of their salary in the ESOP valuation. So even if you are sort of thinking about conservatively, they've maybe put in 3% of their salary into their 401k, but then the company's done 3%, and then they've got another 5% of their salary that the company's funded 100%. So they're walking away annually with 10, 11, 12% of their salary going into retirement, and that significantly builds year over year. And so when a company transacts, like does that transaction and converts to an ESOP for the employees, it doesn't have to be a big change from day 1 to day 2. But what it does mean is they get an additional benefit. That's the simplest way to explain it. Those shares are distributed over time. So typically the financing that covers the transaction, that has to be paid back in 5 to 7 years. But the shares themselves are on a schedule to be dispersed to employees maybe over 30 years or 40 years. And that allows that pool to stay active for new employees to come in, and for employees to turn over, and for growth. And then every year the company has to do an annual valuation, and every person gets a statement that says how many shares they have and what's the value of those shares. And I love the story from Emery Sapp and Sons out of Columbia, where when the company first changed to an ESOP, a couple of the guys were together joking, saying, "Oh, great, here's my first valuation. I have enough money to go buy a Starbucks drink." And then by the time that guy was able to retire, they joked because he could actually buy a Starbucks franchise with that valuation, because year over year it had grown so much. So here's the real kicker for ESOPs. S corps, so companies that are fully S corps with an ESOP, you do not pay federal or state income taxes. So all of a sudden, 30-40% of the profits coming into the business actually get to stay in the business instead of going to taxes. So that is what makes these really attractive to commercial lenders, because you have this additional cash flow available to pay off the debt initially. But then after that, this is what really can lead to that growth we talk about year over year, because you have a lot more cash flow to deal with market changes. We saw during the pandemic that employee-owned companies were more resilient, I think in part because of the cash flow. As the market dips or inflation, you just have more flexibility in your cash flow to make adjustments in the market. So this is the huge benefit of the employee ownership piece for the company itself. A traditional management team still stays in place. The owner could leave immediately, or they could stay on for a short amount of time, or they can stay on for a long period of time. Jack Stack from SRC Holding is an example of that. The PFS Brands from Holt Summit, just north of Jeff City, That's another example of they transitioned to an ESOP in order to help accelerate growth. It wasn't his exit plan, so he has stayed on in the CEO role. Here's the real piece to keep in mind, though, because the Department of Labor and the IRS regulate that. It drives a couple of sort of like the size requirements, and so you have to have at least 20 to 25 employees in order to qualify for an ESOP. And this is because since it's a retirement plan, the Department of Labor and IRS require that there is some diversification in who holds those shares, and they do not allow for less than 15 people. And so most banks won't touch it if you don't have at least 20 or 25 people, because if you fall below that 15, the fines are so steep, it's like a business ending piece. So they say 20 to 25 people. And then because of those regulations, you tend to have specialized attorneys and accountants to do that transaction. And so we typically saying between 1.5 to maybe 3.5 EBITDA. This thank you to Patty for putting that definition in the chat. It's essentially revenue after you take away some things. For those of you who don't deal in EBITDA every day, and I realize it should have an extra D in that EBITDA. For those of you who don't deal in that, I tend to say 10 million in revenue is another marker, but that's really dependent upon the size of your business and complexity. The cost, this goes back to those specialties. The cost to set up an ESOP is going to be somewhere between 150,000 to 350,000, depending on how complex your business is. Sometimes that scares people away from the ESOP because that seems like a big number, but we're not comparing that to zero. What you're comparing that to is a traditional brokered sale. So in any type of business transaction, you're going to have to pay attorneys. You're going to have to pay maybe a brokerage fee. There might be some type of success component where you have to pay a success fee. And so it's not, there might be a little bit more from a typical transaction, but it is not that much. But what you're gaining in tax benefits is really, it can pay off for it. So one of the first steps in becoming an ESOP is a feasibility study where they'd actually crunch the numbers and show you projections to see if that'd be worth it or not. And lastly, on ESOPs, what I'd say is good companies are good candidates for employee ownership. Employee ownership is not a silver bullet. If you're a bad company or a company that with a toxic workplace and you get an ESOP, you're going to be a bad company with a toxic workplace with an ESOP. It doesn't solve those problems. So some of the same things that you would want to be doing to get your business ready to sell to a competitor or private equity, you will want to do for employee ownership. You want to be increasing your profits year over year as you're coming to the end. You want to have a good management team in place to take over when you're about to leave. And you want to have sort of a mindset or a culture that values their employees. Just really briefly, I don't want to go too far into this, but a little bit about how you would structure this transaction for an ESOP. So at the end of the day, what we really want to be able to do is that seller in the bottom left-hand corner, they want to get their cash out of the business so they can retire. And then the company wants to be able to distribute the values of those shares to those employees. So there's a mixture of an external loan and an internal loan that happen as a part of this transaction. And again, I'm not going to go too far into the weeds, but typically what would happen is that seller is putting all the stock, all their equity into the ESOP. And the ESOP gets that. But the ESOP doesn't have any money. And so the ESOP has to get money from the business in order to pay the seller. And so that's where the inside loan comes in. The company provides the money to the ESOP to pay the seller, but the company is getting that money from a bank, a traditional commercial lender. And then oftentimes, and this is where this graphic might be a little bit confusing, often the seller is also doing some seller financing. So it might be 1 to 2/3 commercial lending, and then maybe 1/3 to 2/3 seller financing, depending on the size and scope of the business. And so the seller will get some amount of cash at the time of the transaction, and then they have a note where they get paid off in 5 to 7 years after that. So they still have some skin in the game, but they also can, if that business is continuing to grow, they can actually come out with a little bit more. It is required. Goes back to the regulations, that it's fair market price is what the business has to sell for those shares. And so, that's the price that somebody would pay for it on a free and open market with voluntarily, without under compulsion. So it may not be the same multipliers that you would get for a strategic buyout, but it's still going to be fair market value for that business. I'm just peeking at the chat as we go, just to make sure I'm not missing a particular question. Thank you all for filling in that gap in information. A couple more slides here, then we'll get to the questions. Worker cooperatives, kind of comparing it to an ESOP. It's not a retirement plan. It's really just ways to distribute profits to your employees. So it's a lot less regulated. That means it can be less expensive to set up and a little bit easier in that regard. So in your mind, you're probably familiar with agricultural cooperatives or consumer cooperatives. It functions much the same way, except for the employees are the members. Talked a little bit about those capital accounts instead of shares of retirement. Those accounts go on the books for each employee, and then it's up to that board of directors and the cooperative to manage their cash flow and kind of anticipate when employees leave to make sure they have enough cash on hand to pay out and meet their responsibilities for doing that. It tends to be sort of a circular accountability where the members of the cooperative, they elect the board selects the senior management, and then the senior management runs the business in a way similar to a traditional model where you might have a manager or supervisors and so on. And so it's a shared loop. Of course, your part-time employees don't have that vote or the seat on the board. They're not members of the cooperative, so they would function like traditional employees. You just have to have 3 members to be a worker cooperative. You don't have that 15, 20, 25 minimum. And then where an ESOP, you cannot start a business as an ESOP. You have to convert to an ESOP later on as a business. If you're an LLC, you have to convert likely to an S Corp or a C Corp first, and then into the ESOP, but it has to happen down the road. Worker cooperatives are different. It can work for succession planning. That's how our organization talks about it the most, but you can actually start a business as a worker cooperative as well. You just have to have those 3-member minimum to be able to do that. If you're going to convert to a worker cooperative, it's probably in the $20,000 to $40,000 range. You still want to have an attorney and accountant work on setting up that plan and making that happen. You still do a less exhaustive feasibility study, but it's much more doable from a cash flow perspective than that ESOP is for these smaller businesses. And so you don't have that minimum revenue requirement like you would for an ESOP, but of course you still have to meet the cash flow and be able to continue the business on afterwards. So got into the technical. I just wanted to come back really briefly to say these models really have benefits for the employees, for the community, and for the business itself. And with that, we'll transition here to questions. I'll just say real briefly, other things that we can do or next steps. I can do one-on-one consulting with small businesses, or happy to come and do a similar presentation like this in your area, whether that be we do training for accountants and attorneys and bankers, or could be talking to your senior leaders, or maybe getting other groups like yours together in your community. And Patty, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Keith. That was great. Really informative. I thought for lots of nuts and bolts, and examples. I have one question to start us off with, and I'm going to FYI, everyone, you're going to get a little note that says to unmute yourself. You'll have an opportunity to be unmuted and visit with Keith if you like. And so my question while I'm doing that is, Keith, I've heard this one way of approaching this is to plan with the exit in mind. You know what I mean? Like a whole business strategy for this. Can you talk a little bit about building your business in a way that you could do this?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the partners that you had on your slide early on in the presentation was Missouri SourceLink, and they talk about, most of their work is working with entrepreneurs, and so they talk to even entrepreneurs starting a business to begin your business with the end in mind. So what do you hope is the outcome? How do you hope to exit that, and whether that be retirement or selling out and so on? And so there's some part of that it's never too soon to start thinking about succession planning or exit planning. But once you start, some really key places, one is you can start leaning into the idea of teaching your employees the ownership mindset right where they're at, even though they're not technically owners. And what that means is helping your employees understand how their individual job contributes to the overall mission of the organization, and then how it also contributes to the revenue, to the profits of the organization. And particularly if you have some type of bonus plan or profit sharing mechanism in place, you can start using this to help teach that personal responsibility and help people think about how that individual task can actually contribute to that employee having greater benefit in addition to the business as a whole. And so Great Human Business does some open book management consulting. That's one step. You don't have to go that far, though. Like a starting place is just helping your employees know what their role is and how they can contribute to that bottom line. And then secondarily, that management team, no matter how you intend to exit your business, when you're looking at some type of lending or anything like that, they want to make sure that the management team in place is going to be effective and be able to continue the business after you exit. And so making sure, if you don't have somebody that you've already on board that you think can take over the business, it's time to start looking outside of your business and start hiring on that next CEO so they can work with you for a little bit before you leave.
Yes, thank you. That's a good thought. And probably also having a culture that allows people to get somewhere with their ideas is part of that too.
Yes, absolutely.
Question, and she might add more, but Tina Diedrichsen thought that this might even be really helpful to restart their local chamber of commerce, give local businesses more ownership of the process.
Yeah, that's interesting. So chambers as an association entity, I don't know if there's a model that formally would structure it as a cooperative, but you can take the same principles of this sort of democratic workplace type idea and definitely apply it to other situations. I know the local governments have been doing some consulting in this area as well, of trying to figure out how to leverage this. And more broadly, if you want to look into like the employee engagement piece, that's a whole nother field of study you can lean into as well that has some overlapping values and principles.
Great. Anybody else have a question? You can pipe in or put in the Q&A or raise your hand. That's a little function down there with the little smiley face, and I'll call on you. Tina did add that their Chamber of Commerce had started a farmers market, so that might be one aspect of building a business focus for a chamber. Yes,
absolutely. And farmers markets are, excuse the pun, ripe for worker cooperatives.
Another question I have is about who can help. For example, at New Growth, at our Women's Business Center, and we serve men and women, we're getting training in business succession, and we're going to learn how to work with businesses with employee ownership. But what are the types of people and businesses out there that can help you? And then where do they go for help if they are new to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, we're super excited to be able to work with New Growth to help add in some expertise on the worker cooperative with their and succession planning on their Women's Business Center. Your local SBDC, your regional SBDC is a place to start. We're just starting to do training with SBDC advisors across the state, specifically on employee ownership. But that's still a great place to talk about succession planning, and you can ask questions about employee ownership, and they should be able to find us or get that information. And so that's another great place. I mentioned earlier that we also, it's publicly available, but you can reach out to us. We do one-on-one consulting with business owners to kind of just talk about that next step. So typically we might do this employee ownership one-on-one session. an owner wants to get some more information. So we'll talk with them, learn about their business and kind of what those next steps are. And then we have a list of vetted service providers from across Missouri, and then national experts as well that can help with the technical assistance side of things. And so then we will connect you with them and help you make that handoff to some of those experts. And so there's a lot of private entities that particularly work in the ESOP space, and there's more nonprofit organizations that tend to work in the worker cooperative technical assistance space. And so there's some options there. And then there's the capital side of things, CDFIs and so on can help with figuring out the financial piece of that.
So MOCEO is like our gateway to those resources, whether it's our own business or someone like our local accountant or attorneys that we want to, involve in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have a list of employee-owned businesses. And so we can help connect you with somebody that's a currently employee-owned if you want to talk to somebody else who's already made that transaction or transition and to get that personal experience as well.
Right. Well, unless anybody has any last questions, I just wanted to end with this, in rural communities, losing businesses is bad in general, but also sometimes we only have one grocery store or one pharmacy, and that can really affect a community in a different way than in a city where you might have multiple of those. Can you just comment on that from your experience, or the Silver Tsunami issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually heard a lot of stories about community members coming together to save their grocery store because of how much that would mean to that local community to lose that, and what options you have. You either have to go to the gas station to buy your groceries, or you have to drive 20, 30, 40 minutes to get your groceries. It's just not flexible. And so this is employee ownership is a great option. It's not the right solution for every problem, but having it as a tool in your toolbox just opens up a whole new breadth of opportunities to help keep those businesses in your community and in a way that helps serve your community, but also helps those employees. So both the employees and consumers benefit from a grocery store staying in town or from a pharmacy staying in town. And it just helps the overall local economy. So it's just, again, another great tool to have in your toolbox when we're talking about how to keep those businesses in place.
Right. Well, again, thank you, Keith. That's that's our focus, is keep these rural communities going and growing, and great to have you in the state working on this with all of us. So we're going to end this now, and thank you all for attending. We're going to send out the recording will be on our YouTube channel, and you'll get a link to that in the follow-up email. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Keith.